Ever since the very first atomic bomb was built, humanity has lived under the constant looming fear of nuclear war. There are countless books and movies that dive into the terrifying idea of a world-ending catastrophe caused by nuclear weapons. In these stories, we often see desperate, hopeless people wandering through the wreckage of a civilization left in ruins, poisoned by radiation, stripped of their humanity, and endlessly destroying one another. But what would actually happen in real life? Let's take a moment and think about something as vast and powerful as the ocean. You'd probably assume that places where large-scale nuclear tests were carried out would still show obvious devastating scars. But when we look at them today, they often appear surprisingly untouched, as if nothing ever happened. Take Bikini Atoll, for example, a place that has become a symbol for nuclear testing, yet today it's actually open to tourists. Hey there, everyone! So, where does the truth really lie? Is it possible that the ocean has the capacity to somehow absorb or even neutralize the massive impact of nuclear detonations? Before we dive into the answers, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us on our mission to uncover the truth, one layer at a time. Welcome to our channel. We're glad to have you here. Now, let's break things down and take a closer look at what the facts are actually telling us. Alright then, let's get started. The history of underwater nuclear testing. Between 1946 and 1963, more than 200 nuclear tests were conducted either in the ocean itself or in the air above it. Out of all of those, only 8 were actually carried out underwater. In 1963, nearly every nuclear-armed nation, along with most non-nuclear countries, signed a treaty banning all nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. However, France continued atmospheric testing from 1966 through 1974, and China did the same from 1964 to 1980. There was also one final atmospheric nuclear test believed to have taken place near Bouvet Island in the South Atlantic on September 22, 1979, although the country responsible remains unknown. It's widely suspected that the nations involved in that test were South Africa and Israel, working together behind the scenes. As for underground nuclear testing, that continued until 1996, when the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was finally signed. Except for the mysterious final test in 1979, every ocean-based nuclear explosion was conducted by one of 4 countries: the United States, France, the United Kingdom, or the Soviet Union. The very first underwater nuclear test was carried out by the United States in 1946 at Bikini Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands, under the codename Operation Crossroads. Inspired by this test, French fashion designer Louis Réard created a daringly minimalist swimsuit for women and named it the Bikini, which quickly became a cultural sensation. But for the indigenous islanders of Bikini Atoll, this was no laughing matter, and certainly not a fashionable event. Years later, Greenpeace experts estimated that the total explosive yield of all nuclear tests around the Marshall Islands reached a staggering 108 megatons. Of all the detonations in Operation Crossroads, the most powerful underwater blast came on July 25, 1946, with the testing of the atomic bomb known as Baker. This device earned the chilling nickname the Hell of Bikini and had a yield of 23 kilotons. The Baker bomb exploded 90 feet below the surface, blasting a column of water nearly 1,650 feet wide and shooting it more than 6,500 feet into the sky. Right at the blast zone, the resulting waves reached heights of nearly 100 feet. Following in America's footsteps, the United Kingdom also carried out underwater nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean. By 1963, the UK had conducted 23 nuclear weapons tests near both Australia and the islands of Kiribati. The Soviet Union carried out 3 underwater nuclear tests at its Novaya Zemlya test site, with each bomb being detonated at a depth of around 100 feet. After the Baker test, the United States went on to conduct further underwater nuclear tests under the codenames Wigwam, Umbrella, and Swordfish. Among these, only Wigwam truly qualifies as a deep-sea nuclear test in the full sense of the word. That test was carried out on May 14, 1955, about 500 miles southwest of San Diego, at a depth of 2,000 feet. To this day, Operation Wigwam remains the only known nuclear test ever conducted at a depth greater than 1,000 feet beneath the surface of the sea. The impact of underwater nuclear testing. One important thing to point out is that during nuclear tests in the Pacific, residents of nearby islands were always evacuated in advance. But that was definitely not the case when nuclear tests were conducted in South Australia. At the Maralinga test site in that region, the United Kingdom carried out 7 nuclear tests between 1955 and 1957. While warning signs were posted on the outskirts of the test area to caution people about radiation risks, calling that a proper evacuation plan would be a serious overstatement. Yami Lester, an Aboriginal man who survived these tests, later spoke out about his first-hand experience witnessing one of the British nuclear explosions. According to his testimony, a strange, oily black smoke filled the air, and just hours later, every member of the local Indigenous community began suffering from symptoms like severe diarrhea, skin rashes, and painful eye irritation. Lester himself couldn't open his eyes for 3 weeks, and tragically, several elders in the community didn't survive. But to be clear, that was the result of tests conducted on land. There are no recorded cases of local civilians ever witnessing an underwater nuclear blast. Still, the accounts from people who were directly involved in those underwater tests are truly shocking. At the time, in order to study the destructive power of atomic bombs, ships were deliberately positioned within the immediate blast zone. The largest of these vessels was the retired U.S. Navy battleship Arkansas, which weighed over 27,000 tons and was anchored just 750 feet from the detonation point. When the bomb went off, the ship was crushed as if smashed by a giant hammer, hurled into the air, and then violently slammed down, embedding itself into the ocean floor. Smaller vessels either sank instantly or were swept up by 16-foot-high waves and tossed like splinters onto the sandy shores of the atoll. Incredibly, some of the ships had goats, sheep, and other animals left on board to study the long-term biological effects of radiation exposure. The results of those experiments remain classified to this day. Meanwhile, on August 9, 2023, during an international gathering, Junior Aini, the ambassador from the Marshall Islands to Fiji, spoke about something called Project 4.1. This was a secret U.S. program that involved studying the biological effects of radiation on human beings. The native people of Bikini, Enewetak, Rongelap, and Utirik atolls, all part of the Marshall Islands, were promised early return to their homes after being displaced between 1946 and 1963. In fact, in 1972, around 100 residents voluntarily went back to their ancestral islands. But in May 1978, researchers discovered that the wells they were using for drinking water contained dangerously high concentrations of strontium-90. Blood tests revealed that levels of cesium-137 in the islanders' bodies were several times higher than the safe threshold. As a result, in September 1978, those who had returned were forced to abandon their homeland once again, which by then had become far too hazardous for human health. Research over the last decade has revealed that the biggest concern isn't just radioactive isotopes lingering in the soil, but the overall health of the entire surrounding ecosystem. In fact, people living on islands in the Pacific, sometimes hundreds of miles away from test sites, have suffered from a type of food poisoning called ciguatera. This illness is triggered by microscopic plankton that grow on coral reefs contaminated with radioactive materials. Interestingly, the coral itself isn't directly harmed by radiation, but it serves as the starting point for the food chain where the poisoned plankton grows. Fish then consume this plankton, and eventually humans eat those fish. Recent studies now confirm that this contaminated coral is the root cause behind the ciguatera outbreaks, not just in the Marshall Islands, but also in places like Kiritimati Island and across French Polynesia. Can the ocean really withstand the power of nuclear bombs? So why do some researchers genuinely believe that the ocean is practically unfazed by atomic bombs? One of the main reasons behind this belief is the surprising presence of vibrant organic life inside the crater left behind by the first atomic explosion near Bikini Atoll. When scientists surveyed the crater in 2017, they were stunned to find an enormous colony of coral thriving along its inner walls. All around it, as if nothing had ever happened, fish of all kinds swam freely while crabs and other marine creatures crawled along the seafloor. In theory, this should have been a lifeless desert scorched by radiation, yet the entire area was bursting with life. And still, this peaceful underwater paradise doesn't change the fact that fish can absorb radioactive isotopes, which eventually end up causing humans to suffer from illnesses like ciguatera poisoning. This brings to mind a haunting scene from a certain movie. In it, almost all of humanity has been wiped out by nuclear war, and in the middle of a vast, lifeless, radioactive wasteland, black poppies stretch endlessly across the landscape. Just like the coral growing inside a nuclear blast crater, these poppies seem to flourish even under intense radiation. People who believe the ocean is immune to radiation often compare it to the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. For example, while numerous mutated animals have been observed in the Chernobyl zone, there have been no such reports from the sea. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The coral reefs around Bikini Atoll have grown even larger than those found in unaffected regions. And those corals are surrounded by thousands of fish, including rare species like tuna, along with sharks, crabs, and all kinds of sea life. According to experts who hold this view, the destructive power of an atomic bomb is actually much less severe in the ocean than it is on land. For instance, underwater shockwaves dissipate incredibly quickly and don't generate massive tsunamis like the ones caused by earthquakes. That's because a tsunami is triggered when hundreds of square miles of the ocean floor shift, displacing massive volumes of water across long distances, whereas a nuclear explosion is a localized event that only affects a small area, like in Bikini Atoll, where the water displacement was limited to around 1,600 feet. The waves from that blast vanished just a few miles from the epicenter. But what these believers consider their strongest and most convincing argument is the difference in how radioactive isotopes spread on land versus underwater. On land, radioactive elements mix with dust and debris, get picked up by the wind, and can travel thousands of miles across continents. Eventually, they fall back to Earth as rain or snow and get absorbed by plants, animals, and people. In the ocean, however, radioactive particles dissolve into the water across a wide area when a bomb goes off. Their concentration drops off sharply as you move away from the blast site, and thanks to the ocean's constant circulation, the contamination gradually fades to background levels. You could compare this process to diluting a lethal poison in water over and over until the mixture becomes completely harmless to drink. That kind of explanation can be somewhat reassuring, but only if we're talking about just a few isolated nuclear explosions. In that case, it's like a small cut on the surface of the Earth's skin, something the planet can heal from rather quickly. Unfortunately, though, the damage caused by nuclear activity doesn't end with those underwater explosions that have already taken place. We also have to factor in the radioactive waste buried at sea, the active nuclear reactors powering submarines and naval ships, and the waste released into the ocean from nuclear power plants used for peaceful energy production. And let's not forget, at least 6 nuclear bombs have gone missing somewhere at sea. These weapons now sit at the bottom of the ocean, slowly breaking down and continuously leaking radioactive toxins into the surrounding waters. Just recently, signs of radioactive contamination were discovered in the Mariana Trench, nearly 7 miles deep, and that may not be a coincidence. That's why we can't afford to fool ourselves. We have to take the issue of underwater nuclear detonations seriously and face it head-on. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like and share it on your favorite social media platforms. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Until next time, take care and goodbye.